All right. Native plants are the species that are naturally found in your region, wherever that is. And those plants have co-evolved with the native wildlife over the course of thousands of years. And the two depend on each other for survival. So in North America, a plant's often deemed native to a specific region if it was present before colonization. So the picture here has a few of the native plants that we provided as seeds for folks for this workshop. So we have the native columbine, we have blue lobelia, and we have the joe pye.
Hold on, I don't know if everybody else is seeing the same thing as I am. I'm still seeing just not the active slideshow. I'm just still seeing your page, like your.
Oh, you know what? It says screen sharing is paused. Okay, hold on. Let's see why that is. Hold on. How's that?
Yes.
All right. So we'll try that again. So this right here is our native lobelia, our native columbine. The blue lobelia is in the center, and joe pye weed is here. And those are some of the seeds that we provided folks today with. So I wanted to talk about what invasive species are as well, because a lot of times you'll hear that term often when we speak about native plants. And the U.S. Forestry Service defines invasive plants as one, non-native or alien to the ecosystem under consideration, and two, whose introduction causes or is likely to cause economic or environmental harm or harm to human health. Unfortunately, we have many plant and animal species in Massachusetts that fit that bill. So has anybody noticed this plant growing along our highways? You can see the fluffy seed heads during the fall and the winter along almost any highway you travel down. Unfortunately, this plant is called Phragmites. The downy fluff on these seed heads of Phragmites was used as a packing material on ships over 400 years ago coming from Europe. And when they docked, they unpacked crates and they just toss the fluff off the boats. Now it's growing all over our waterways. In Europe, there are 170 species of insects that eat Phragmites. In the US, there's only 5 species of insects. So that means we would need 1,000 more years for it to potentially adapt like a native plant and other species to co-evolve and to be able to utilize it. In the meantime, it continues to outcompete all the other wetland plants in a wide variety of settings. So in urban areas, in rural areas, in saltwater, in freshwater, in wild venues. So because the plant has so few natural predators, be they insects, birds, mammals, it continues displacing the native plants and all the other species, the birds, insects, and mammals that rely on the native species that they've co-evolved with. So here is another popular invasive species you may have seen. This is garlic mustard. So in the 1860s, garlic mustard was brought to the US as a culinary herb for potager gardens. It's escaped into the wild and it's begun taking over the understory of forests. It controls access to light, water, and nutrient sources of the other plants that were growing in those understories. And researchers have found that garlic mustard is what's called allelopathic. It means it releases chemicals that are toxic and they reduce the growth of all the other plants around it. And they also believe that these same compounds hinder the beneficial relationships some plant species have with soil fungi as well. So in the first year, this is what the rosettes of the plant look like. And then in the second year, the leaves change and you can see that it's flowering. And in that last picture, you can see that's the understory that's completely covered with garlic mustard. So again, this invasive species having no natural predators to eat that is outcompeting everything along with its allelopathic compounds. So you've heard me talking about the coevolution of species together. So this is one I think a lot of people are more aware of. We've all heard about the declining monarch populations. Perhaps you've noticed we don't see as many as we used to see. By and large, plants can tolerate a wide range of environmental conditions. That's why so many plants from other places successfully live here. So China is on the same latitude as we are here. That's why we have so many plants that come from that part of Asia to the United States to be grown here. And what the people have found is that, you know, they have no natural predators, so they plant these things and nothing eats them and they stay beautiful all the time, but not realizing the impact that has going forward. So with monarchs, so again, by and large, plants can tolerate a wide range of environmental conditions, but insects tend to be specialists, feeding on and pollinating just a narrow spectrum of plant life, sometimes just a single species. The entomologist Doug Tallamy tells us that 90% of the insects that eat plants can develop and reproduce only on the plants which they share in evolutionary history. So I'm going to say that again because that's pretty huge. 90% of the insects that eat plants can develop and reproduce only on the plants with which they share an evolutionary history. So monarchs have co-evolved with milkweeds. These are all different types of milkweeds on your screen there. And this is a monarch caterpillar. And so as they've co-evolved, the butterflies developed a unique adaptation that allows their caterpillars to feed on a plant that many others cannot. And that's because milkweeds have a latex-based sap that contains a toxic compound called a carotenoid. Most other insects can't digest this. It either kills them or it tastes so bad that they avoid it altogether. But monarch caterpillars are able to absorb the toxins as they feed on the milkweed leaves, and that renders the caterpillars themselves toxic to their predators. So the caterpillars and the adult butterflies are protected from birds and other predators because of the compounds in this plant that they feed on. So where there's no milkweed growing in roadsides or in wild spaces in people's yards anymore, there's now no food source for the monarch butterfly's babies, the monarch caterpillar. These insects are specialists and they need what plants they have co-evolved with for survival. So milkweed is what's called a larval host plant. So it's the larval host plant as the caterpillar is the larval stage of the monarch butterfly. So that plant is the larval host plant. That's another word you'll see often when you're looking at plants. They'll say that this plant is a larval host plant for certain butterflies. So planting those, you're providing a food source that's very necessary for certain plants. So here in Massachusetts, we have fantastic research being done locally. Some of it as local as Southborough, Massachusetts, by Dr. Robert Gigier. He's a researcher who worked out of WPI. Right now he's working out of UMass Dartmouth, and he is studying endangered bumblebees of Massachusetts. In Massachusetts, we have 11 species of bumblebees, 3 of which are in a sharp decline and are in serious concern right now. So Dr. Gagir reminds us that the pollen sources from native plants are critical because they enable bees to make more bees. So when you're thinking pollen, pollen is what they use to rear their young. Nectar sources from native plants are critical because they provide the fuel. So nectar is the fuel and pollen is what they use to make rear brood, make babies. So the nectar sources provide fuel for adult bees and butterflies to be active. And then host plants are critical because they give caterpillars, the larval stage of moths and butterflies, something to eat. So remember the monarchs on the milkweed. So including plants that provide all 3 of these functions to as many species as possible throughout the growing season is critical for developing effective conservation plans for native pollination systems. So that's the animal and the plant side of that equation. So Dr. Gagir has a wonderful list of the native plants he studied and the impact they have on bees, such as Bombus vagans, Bombus fervidus, and Bombus terricola, which are all at-risk species right now in Massachusetts. From the seeds that we provided, Joe Pye, Blue Lobelia, Penstemon digitalis, and butterfly weed are all found to support these at-risk species. And that doesn't mean that the others don't. It's simply what he's found thus far. For his full list, Emily can pop into the chat a link that can get you to there. It's the link will be to our resources list on our website, and it has all of Dr. Gagir's research there so you can find it if you'd like to see those lists. So I think a lot of people have come to learn about native plants from the entomologist Doug Tallamy. He's written several books and he's an amazing researcher. He has shown that native oak trees support over 500 species. That's 500 species of caterpillars. Where a ginkgo tree, which is a commonly planted landscape tree that comes from Asia, hosts only 5 species of caterpillars. And I'm going to ask you guys to just remember this as we go forward, because this is going to be really important. So it takes 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars to raise 1 brood of chickadees. And the parents forage within a 150-foot radius of their nest. When it takes over 6,000 caterpillars to raise 1 brood of chickadees, we think back to the oak versus the ginkgo, and the availability of the caterpillars on those 2 trees is a significant difference. So 500 species of caterpillars versus 5 species of caterpillars. So where will the birds be finding their food? Clearly on our oaks, right? As opposed to these other trees that aren't native to our area. And it's important to have the plants that support these lower trophic level creatures, such as caterpillars, so that they can feed those higher trophic level creatures, such as birds. So think back to the food webs we all learned in elementary school, and then what happens when those food webs are disrupted. Non-native plants are not only affecting the food for the caterpillars, but they're impacting the ecosystem services that sustain us as well. So Doug Tallamy tells us that we are at a critical point of losing so many species from the local ecosystems, and along with them is their ability to produce the oxygen, clean water, provide flood control, pollination, pest control, carbon storage, etc. That is the ecosystem services that sustain us will become severely compromised. We see that the birds and the insects are disappearing at an alarming rate. And now hopefully we can begin to see and understand better that link to the native plants. So up to this point, I feel like it's been all doom and gloom. But again, Doug Tallamy tells us that over 83% of the land in the US is private land. And so that's all of us. And he says that our national parks, no matter how grand in scale, are too small and separated from one another to preserve species to the levels needed. Therefore, he formed the concept of a homegrown national park. So it's a bottom-up call to action to restore habitat where we live, where we work, extending national parks to our yards and our communities. So homegrown national parks. You can go to their website. You can register your own yard. I know a couple of people who are on this call have already done that as they've started planting. And you can see how much land is now in a homegrown national park. The website is at the top of the screen. So I've talked your ear off about Doug Tallamy, so I can't recommend enough his books, his videos, podcast presentations. He clearly communicates the message that can sometimes be very complicated and challenging to understand. So I highly recommend any of the books. If you're going to choose just one to get started, I would actually suggest Nature's Best Hope. It's really fantastic. I feel like it covers a broad range, a little bit of everything. So what we can do, this is a brochure from the Homegrown National Park website. It shows some of the ways, some of the things that we can do. So creating habitat in our yards can create places for those specialist insects like the monarch to lay their eggs and allow their caterpillars a place to feed and transform. It can provide a place for birds and butterflies to stop and feed as they migrate. An oak tree can provide enough caterpillars for many, many clutches of birds to be raised. Some insects spend their whole life cycle in one tiny portion of your yard, and then the next generation and the next generation. So if half of the American lawns were replaced with native plants, we could create the equivalent of a 20 million acre national park. So that's 9 times bigger than Yellowstone, 100 times bigger than Shenandoah National Park. So today we're all going to get started. I'm going to teach you a simple way to start growing native plants, and we can all start to make a big impact. I'm going to stop sharing my screen here, and we're going to move on to our hands-on portion. All righty. Does anybody have any questions at this point? If you want to raise your hand or pop a question in the chat, I'm happy to answer things as best I can. As I said, I'm learning along with everyone, so I'll do my best. And if there's somebody else in the group who can answer the question, that's great. Linda, would you like to ask a question?
Yes, I
Did
would.
Beth rejoin us?
I live in a retirement community, and there is so much done here that is so terrible for our ecosystem. And I'm wondering if there is anyone who can possibly come to a meeting at some point and talk to the manager and the CEO, and maybe we can get 1 or 2 board members to come also. Is that possible?
I think that could be something that we could do. Possibly
Okay.
Emily and I could do something like that for you, or
Okay.
somebody else in the group. You know, we can kind of share the message. And even, you know, say next winter, if you guys as a community wanted to do a project like we're going to do today, that could be something you do as a community, and you could create your own gardens there at the property. So that's really one of the hopes of this Worcester Plant Initiative, is communities, so that they can start doing this as well within, you know, the smaller communities around the city. So
Okay, thank you.
so definitely reach out to me afterwards, Linda, and we can hopefully help you with that.
Thank you.
You're
I have
welcome.
a question.
Did somebody else say they have a question?
Yes.
This is Beth. I have a quick question. I
Sure.
forgot to pick up seeds from the bookcases at the UU Church. Is it too late to get seeds? I was told there were some extra packets there.
Leonardo, do you know if there's still seeds in the free library?
I'm not sure if there is any, but
Or
we definitely
Carol?
have more seeds.
I also have plenty of seeds to share. I have some different varieties. So if people would like some more after this is over, you can if you want to hang on to the call at the end, we can make plans to get seeds to whoever would like them, especially if you think that you would like to do this with a bigger group. You know, after today's presentation, I know there's some educators on here. We can definitely get you some seeds. Hey, Carol.
I just checked the mailbox yesterday, and the basket still has maybe about 20.
Okay.
Packets. Yeah.
Okay, super. So if you're looking for something else, I
Plus,
have some others
Leo and
here
I
as
have
well
a
that
lot
we
of
can
seeds
share.
left. My little niece wanted to know, how come some seeds are so tiny and some are big?
That's a great question. And you know what? Seeds are just like people, right? We come in all different shapes and sizes and colors. And the seeds are really neat because they have lots of different ways to spread themselves around. So you might have some seeds that have a little bit of fluff on them. And those are, the wind picks up and it blows those seeds around with that fluff. And there's other seeds that might be big and heavy and they just drop right to the ground off the plant that they're from. So they have all different ways to move around, and part of that is their shape.
Thank you.
You're welcome. I think there's some questions in the chat. I'm just gonna try to read real quick. Patricia, you asked about where we can buy oak trees. So this is a really interesting thing that I learned because I read Doug Tallamy's book about oak trees, is that the best way to grow an oak tree is to actually start it from an acorn. And the reason for that is that a lot of times people will buy from a nursery a well-established oak tree, and it takes that tree so long to actually establish after being dug and replanted that he said it's actually more favorable to start an oak from an acorn. So if you have an acorn, you can get that started right into a small pot and then eventually into the space where you want it to grow. They are slow growing at first, and that's because oaks have an amazing root system. And so much of the energy when that plant is just getting started is below the ground. So in that first year, you'll see it come up above the ground, but it's not going to look very showy. It's going to be really small because it's working so hard on that robust root system that it has. And that's also what makes them another great resource for us here in Massachusetts. With that big giant root system, they're able to take in lots of water that's coming in from rain and from, you know, overflow of streets and all the areas that aren't grown in plants with deep roots. So the oaks are a really great, they call them a keystone species, and there's several keystone species and they are one of them.
Nikki.
Yep.
Do you know if, I can look it up myself as well, but with acorns, do you know if it's better to try to plant when they're like green or when they're, when they're eventually brown? But sometimes I don't know if they're too old at that point.
Usually when they've dropped is like the best time to get them,
Yeah.
when they're fresh and they've fallen. Like I was out in the woods the other day and I was seeing lots of them were just starting now to send out a shoot.
Oh,
So
okay.
now's a good time to go and look. You might be able to find one that's even starting to emerge and you can put it right into a pot. Or try a bunch of them. I mean, it's pretty cheap to go and find some acorns and put them in pots, right? So you don't have a lot to lose.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. I hope that helps.
Yeah, my kids always like to collect them, so we'll see if, we'll go check it out, see if we can find some.
So when you start the acorns, you are going to want to protect them because they're delicious, right? For all our squirrels and chipmunks and things. So it's good to put like some chicken wire or something over that pot as it gets growing at first.
I'm gonna chime in.
Otherwise somebody will steal it.
I'm going to chime in, Noelle, on the kid front and collecting acorns. You want to make sure there are no holes in them that have been nibbled by little insects that have laid their eggs. So when your kids collect acorns, there's now a collection of tiny other creatures in your house. I now inspect acorns to make sure they're completely solid before they enter the house, because there are plenty of other insects that use them to lay their eggs and nibble and eat. So
Okay, that's a good point.
anecdotal, mom lessons of acorns in your house.
All right. Was there anything else in the chat?
Yes, there's a question in the chat from Kenza about it. I'll read it. It's wanted to know, when removing invasive species, how long before we plant a native one, considering that the soil might have been heavily treated with a pesticide?
That's a good question that I'm really not sure about, and it would depend what they use to treat the soil. I would advocate for trying to pull up plants as opposed to using pesticides to kill them, unless you have someone who really knows what they're doing. Usually when they use pesticides, like they use an herbicide called like a Roundup, which is they would inject that directly into the plant, or they paint it on cut portions. But usually you would want to have somebody who really knows what they're doing do that, so you don't have contaminated soil all around. You can always try planting plants right there and seeing what'll grow. It's hard to know without knowing what was used to treat the area previously, though.
Yeah, I would second that. It's kind of a hit or miss as to this level of soil contamination, and some New England plants are hardy, and if the pesticide wasn't applied to their leaves, they can make a comeback. There's another question in the chat. If we don't have space for an oak tree, are there other things that we can plant that will support caterpillars?
Definitely. And actually there are some oaks that are smaller. There's many varieties of oak trees. So if you really want to have an oak, I would say look into the different species that are native to Massachusetts, and maybe there's one that would fit your area, but there's lots of other plants. So maybe you're interested in, so there's like a butterfly called the spicebush swallowtail. And there's a shrub called spicebush, which is a beautiful yellow flowering shrub. A lot of people, we actually recommend it when people have forsythia as something. You remove your forsythia and you can plant spicebush because it has a really beautiful early spring yellow blossom. But again, it's a larval host source for one of these native butterflies. But there's lots and lots of different shrubs and herbaceous perennials that would support different caterpillars. Probably, I mean, oaks are I mean, they're also enormous, so they can support up to 500 species. I don't think there's anything else that we have that would support that many species, but you know, every plant that you plant can make a big impact. So
I have a question.
sure.
Hi. With regard to, you know, putting in the native plants in areas that have an invasive species, which I'm battling valiantly in the back lot where I garden. I don't know the exact name. It's got devil in the thing in the description, but it has very thin, lacy roots, and that will like wrap around, you know, whatever plants that you plant. So I don't use any chemicals. I'm uprooting it all, but has anybody dealt with this particular plant that has a very lacy roots on the top and then a kind of mother load from which many of the, looks a little bit like a strawberry type of growing, but so that's my first question. And are forsythia not good to have in the garden?
Forsythia are not native to our area. And they actually, if you pay attention to them in the spring, basically no one utilizes them because again, no one has that, none of the native insects around here have co-evolved with them. So it's virtually a dead space as far as providing for the native insects and birds. And it's great to have really early plants. So like a spice bush is early, or we have some other early plants in New England because, you know, at that time we have lots of bumblebee queens that are emerging. So it's important to have resources for them early in the season when they come out before they start their new nest for the year. So when we have plants like a giant forsythia taking up lots of room, but not providing any resources for our native populations, you know, it would be plant in that space. For the, do you know what the invasive is, Emily?
I'm going to ask. So Claire,
Okay.
I'm going to pop an article that I just Googled into the chat to see if this is what you are seeing. It's not an invasive that I have experience with. It's called devil's tear thumb or devil's tail. And it's been around in Massachusetts. This says articles 2009. So it's around. I have not personally worked with it. So this is an old Boston article. So there's always more invasives to find. Unfortunately, I don't have any personal experience with it, except for it looks just as nasty as the rest of them.
So one of the things that we can do as we remove these invasive plants, and Emily and I have been sort of experimenting a little bit with this in some of our areas because we've found, you know, we have invasive plants in our habitats in our yards, is planting some of the more aggressive native plants to try and outcompete or to at least hold the line. So I have a patch of Japanese knotweed across the road from me, and I keep hacking it back as best I can and trying to remove it. Last year I planted, it's a native windflower, anemone flower, and it's considered a fairly aggressive native plant. And my hope is that either it's going to outcompete this or it's going to maybe just hold the line, and I can keep hacking away at this Japanese knotweed for however long I need to until it's gone. So, you know, we can use these plants to work for us as well, you know, to try to outcompete some of these invasives. But trying to remove is really the best option if you can. And you may have to keep doing that for many, many years.
All right, one last thing from the chat was Kristen said about having good success letting wild cherries grow in her yard because they support many species, include tiger swallowtails. Personally, I both oaks and cherries, and the chickadees love the cherry tree just as much. Like their nest is right in between the two things because they get the caterpillars from both trees. So I second the cherries, and they're not as they're not as enormous. And they really are a lovely tree. One more that Ruth, can you talk a little about the direct impact on human survival? Oh, and can we share the specific name of the anemone? I will put the anemone name in the chat. And then we can talk about, direct impact on human survival, on pollinators, and the decline of our own species.
Right. So it will affect us, as we've said, as some of these plants are taking over waterways, that's going to impact the creatures that live in those waterways. So if people can no longer fish in the waterways, we now, lose a resource for foods. If these plants become invasive in our fields where we're growing agricultural crops, that can affect us. If not having these native pollinators here to pollinate our plants for us, that will affect our food crops. Also, having shallow rooted plants as opposed to these beautiful deep rooted plants, that's gonna affect, flood control in different areas and where we can live. So there's a lot of impacts, that having these native species can help with. So those are what we talked about. Those things are called the ecosystem services. So that's the term that is often used. So that's, the producing of oxygen, the cleaning of water, flood control, pollination, pest control. And pest control can be, eating insects. So having lots and lots of bats in our area eating lots of the mosquitoes, that's disease control. We don't think about that because people spray so many chemicals, and instead they could be encouraging bats to be doing that work, or having the dragonflies do that work. Dragonflies are so susceptible to the chemicals that people use all around us. So when they come down the streets spraying for mosquitoes, they're also killing off our dragonflies, and our dragonflies are, who's eating those mosquitoes, and mosquitoes carry, illness as well. So, by killing off those creatures, we're killing off the ability to fight some of the disease that we could incur. All right, I think I'm going to move over to the milk jugs right now, if that's good with everybody. You can still ask questions, put them in the chat. We'll go back and we can ask more questions. I'm happy to keep fielding, or Emily can respond in the chat with answers as well. So, all right, so I don't know if some folks are going to do this in real time with me or not, but we'll go nice and slow so everybody can see this. And hopefully if you went and picked up seeds, you got a handout. Emily, will you spotlight the milk jug as well for me? Thank you.
It's been spotlighted this whole time. Sorry.
That's okay.
You've been watching your hands on the side.
So we have this handout right here that everybody should have gotten. And if you didn't, we will send the PDF after this with everybody. We'll send a follow-up email, and we'll also send a PDF of this, so you'll have a copy of that as well. So Emily, did you say that it is on, okay, let me.
Unless everyone wants to disagree, what I see is I see the milk jug and I see Nikki. So we.
Oh, you do? Okay, because I'm not seeing that. So let me just switch to full screen. I'm just seeing you as my full screen.
Lucky.
I just want to be able to see my hands up close. That's okay. Just I can click on the picture just so I can make sure that when I'm showing you things, you
You're-
can actually see what I'm
Maybe
trying to show you.
change your own view. You're both of your cameras are pinned. So if you change your view, you might be able to see it differently.
All right, can
Well,
everybody
Kristen-
see the milk jug now?
I actually pinned, I wasn't seeing two screens, but I pinned the one with the jugs. People can do that too.
Okay, I just spotlighted the jugs and
Okay. All right, Kristen's all set. Good. All right.
okay. I think that should have everybody have 2 images right now, hopefully. So we're gonna get going. So the reason that I love using the milk jugs to start the native plants is because the milk jug acts as a mini nursery, and it creates this little microclimate that mimics Mother Nature. Our seeds are protected from being eaten, and the seedlings are being protected from being eaten. And it mimics nature in the regard that native plants need a cold stratification period. So what happens is these plants, when they're growing, out in our yards in the fall, they're going to produce seeds. Those seeds are going to fall, and they have this adaptation where when those seeds fall, they don't immediately germinate. And that's because here in New England, if those seeds germinated immediately, they wouldn't have enough time to safely get growing before winter came. So they have the adaptation where they need a certain amount of time of cold and wet conditions before they germinate. So we're providing that in these milk jugs by planting them in the milk jugs, but then putting them outside so they get those cold winter conditions that they need. So that's called the cold stratification period. So for the materials we're going to need today, we have our container, which can be a milk jug, it can be a water jug, clear, a half gallon or a gallon. It can be a juice container that's clear. You can use, let's see, like they're 1 pound salad green containers. You would use 2 of them and you would put one on top of the other. You'd have to make holes in the top of that because it doesn't have a fantastic hole already built in like our milk jugs do. So we have our containers. We're going to need something to cut with. So we can use a drill. We can use a box cutter. You can use a glue gun. You can use a soldering iron. You can use a scissor. We do need a scissor separately. We're going to need a labels, markers, and duct tape, and something to water the jugs with when we're finished. So let's get started. So first, you want to get rid of that cap. Put it in the recycling bin. You don't need it. You don't want to even consider later on, should I put the cap on? Should I take the cap off? Just get rid of it because you never going to put that cap back on. So the reason is that we want moisture going in and we want moisture coming out. So when in the summertime, when it's starting to get warm, we want the excess moisture to come up and out, the humidity to come out. So we are going to make our holes in the bottom. And the reason that we do that is because we want to have whatever water goes in to also have the ability to come out. Otherwise, we're going to have a jug full of soil soup, and we don't want that. So to make these holes, here, I'm going to show you a couple different ways. You can use the drill, like I told you. So I'm going to drill some holes here. So we're looking to do 8 to 10 holes in the bottom of the jug. All right, so you can see those holes. You can use a box cutter. So a box cutter is really great. You're gonna, sorry, I'm trying to get a good angle for you here. You're gonna push it right in. Once it goes in, you want to give it a twist just to make it open up a little bit so you can see that hole there. So I really like the box cutter. When I would do this, I would put the milk jug between my legs and push it in. And I always felt a little nervous, like I was gonna jab myself in the thighs. So then I've moved on to using the drill more often than the box cutters, but that's just me. I'm also fairly clumsy, so. And then for the crafters in the group, we have our glue gun. So this is a heated glue gun. You want to work with what you have. This isn't like go out and buy all these crazy supplies. We should be able to do this and find a way with what we have at home. So with our glue gun, we can just push that right through to make a hole. I don't think I got this hot enough. Oh, there we go. So you can see the hole there. You can see this is getting a little smushed. That's okay, because once we cut it open, we can pop it back out. So like I said, we want about 8 to 10 holes in the bottom of the jug. All right, our next step is we're going to cut the jug open. So we want to leave enough room at the bottom of the jug to have a robust root system. So we need to have enough soil in there for that to happen. So where I usually start cutting is right at the base of the handle of the milk jug, because I know that that's about 3 inches, and you want to have between 2.5 to 3 inches of soil in the bottom of your jug to give these the root system that they really need, and so they don't dry out early in the season. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to make a little cut there with my box cutter. You can do it with a scissor too, but and then I'm going to go all the way around till I reach the label. When I reach the label, I actually stop. And I'm going to show you why in a second. And I go back to the handle and I go the other way until I get to that label on the back, and I stop again. So the reason I stop is I'm going to use this as a hinge. So I don't want it to be opened up all the way. I'm going to hinge that, and then I'm going to pop down the bottom of my milk jug that got a little smushed when we were making our holes. Does anybody have any questions about what you saw so far before I move forward? I can't actually see the chat, so Emily or anybody, just chime in if you have a question.
Yeah, nothing in the chat right now.
Okay, then I'm going to keep going. So the next step is we're going to put some soil in here. For soil, I recommend a potting mix, not topsoil, not seed starting mix. Seed starting mix will dry out. Topsoil will be too heavy. The potting soil is just right. So we're going to use that. I really like Pro Mix, makes a great potting mix. Also, Happy Frog makes a great potting mix. Coast of Maine makes a great potting mix. So those are some good options that you can definitely find all around us here. I'm getting my soil here. So we are going to put our soil right into the jug here. Just going to even that out gently. So you'd rather have more soil than less soil. Again, I just want to say that because it's important, you know, for those healthy root systems and so they don't dry out. I have an envelope of seeds here, and I have really teeny tiny seeds also. So I'm going to open these up here. Bear with me, these are so small. All right, so you can see I have these teeny tiny seeds. The seeds that we put into the envelopes for you, it should be enough to do 1 milk jug. That's kind of how we portion them, with the idea that you could put plenty in 1 milk jug. So I'm gonna just, as evenly as possible, sprinkle these over the top of my milk jug here. Right. They get a small handful of soil. So those seeds were so teeny tiny. So again, what we're trying to do is mimic Mother Nature. So in nature, when those seeds are dispersed, they're going to fall to the ground. So maybe a little bit of soil might cover them. You know, when we're vegetable gardening, we're thinking about the depth of the seeds as being, I think it's like 3 times the width of the seed is how deep you generally would put your seeds. With these, you know, we're doing something a little different. The seeds are often a lot tinier. They're just going to be at the surface. You can put just a tiny amount of soil over all of these. Some of the bigger seeds you can cover a little bit more, but really it's a dusting of soil. So I take just a small amount of soil and I'm going to put my hands together like this, and I'm just going to rub them so that a tiny bit just rubs right over the surface of the soil, and that's it. And then what I like to do is just take the back of my hand and gently, this is not pressing down, it's not compacting. All I'm trying to do is gently touch the seeds to the soil so that they're just making that connection with the soil. That's all. All right. So another important thing is to label your milk jugs, because you think you're going to remember what everything is, but you won't. So here we go. I like to label twice just to be safe. So I'm going to label mine here.
Nikki, I'm going to interrupt for a second.
Yes.
So Linda asked a question which we're going to get to in a minute, but she said that she's using about 50 seeds in the packet for the wild bergamot. You can answer that, but it's different than vegetable planting where you're not spacing them out the same way. So that was the question of
Okay,
number of seeds.
so that's a really good question. So it does seem like we gave you a lot of seeds, and we're going to talk about how we're going to plant these out later. So when you're growing a tomato plant and you put that seed into a container, you're planting one single plant out afterwards, right? You have one seedling and that's going to be your plant. You might plant lots of them, but they're singles. When we're planting these out later, we're going to do what's called a hunk of seed method, where we're going to take them out of the containers in nice clumps. So your clump is going to have a cluster of lots of plants. And the great thing about native plants is that when they're all growing together, they're packed somewhat snugly because they actually support each other by, you know, with the taller ones and the lower ones, so that those heavy tall ones don't just fall over. So we're going to use a method called a hunk of seeds a little bit later, and I'll talk about that some more when we get towards the end. But so it does seem like a lot of seeds, but we're not individually prying these apart later on. We're going to keep them together. So 1 milk jug will give you, I mean, it could be 4, it could be 8, it could be 16 hunks of seeds that you can then plant out as individual plants. All right, I am gonna label the top of my jug. I put a label inside, and I always do one on the top as well.
Nikki, so for everybody, Nikki's using a very special marker. We've tried, did you talk about the marker?
I did not, but that's a good point.
I will
can
put a
show
link
this.
and put the link, but you can go ahead and talk about the marker.
Sure. So conventional markers fade really easily when they're out in the sun, and we found this marker, very wonderfully named garden marker. It's from Amazon, but it's for outdoor use. And so it really holds up to the sun. You can use a Sharpie. If you use a Sharpie and you're labeling in 2 places, you're probably going to be fine. A lot of people will write on like a popsicle stick with pencil and that indentation holds, or with like a ballpoint pen on a piece of, you know, a wooden popsicle stick, and that indentation along with the ink can show. But for me, I found that this marker, I'll show it again, garden marker, it just lasts amazingly out in the garden. So it's really helpful, especially if you're doing a lot of seeds and maybe you don't even know what the plant is going to look like when it germinates. I mean, for me, like if I'm planting lettuce, I can recognize what a lettuce seedling looks like, but some of the native seeds that, you know, I only see a little bit when they're in this really tiny stage, I wouldn't be able to recognize like that. So it's really helpful to have the correct label on there.
Nikki, I'm so glad you mentioned the markers. I was so desperate. I'm gonna just put numbers and have a chart inside with, you know, like jug number 1 has this, jug number 2 has this, but I think the marker is really cool.
The numbering system, lots of people use a numbering system for the jugs as well. I've seen that. For me, that gets too complicated. I'd rather just put the names on everything and put it twice. But I think a number system is a great way if you have it on, you know, as long as you don't lose that piece of paper with the numbers, what they relate to, you're good. So the next thing we're going to do is water these. I'm just going to put mine on a cloth here since I'm going to do it on the table for you. What I do normally when I do this at home for myself, I water them in the kitchen sink, and I use the spray nozzle from the kitchen sink on a super gentle stream to water them. But we can do it also with a water jug. So I'm going to very gently water these in. So I'm going to give it just a little drink. I'm going to allow the water to go down. You don't want to have a really harsh stream on this because you're going to disperse your seeds, and you don't want that. You want them to stay put. So do it nice and gentle. Let the water go down. Add a little more water. Let it go down. So you can see the water is coming through on this jug because it's coming through those holes in the bottom. So that's a good sign. That means it's probably well watered. I'll give it another little drink, a little extra. It's all, anything extra is okay because it's going to come right out the bottom if there's too much water. Sorry, I'm trying to get everything on the table and not dump a watering can on my computer. So you can see on the side of the jug here, you can see the moisture has gone down through the jug and it's coming through the hole. So that's a good sign that it's well watered. So next we're going to close this up. So I like to use duct tape. I found that packing tape does not hold. So the duct tape's really the best. I see. So tap water does have chlorine in it, but it is not a problem. I've been using the Worcester tap water for years and years doing this and have had no issues with it. I get our tape here. So we're going to seal the containers because we want to keep that moisture in, and the heat that will arise in when springtime eventually comes, the heat will stay in, and the cover will also keep the critters out of our jugs. So let me move this a little bit so you can see this. So the way that I do this, I mean, if you have 2 people, that's probably an even better way to do it. But I usually just grab the top lid with the duct tape and pull it down and wrap it around. And it does not have to, that was a really big piece of duct tape that I used. Even if it just goes to where your hinge is, that's fine. Even if it's still open a tiny bit on the sides, like there's a little crack here that, you know, water can go in, it'll come back out. It's okay. It does not have to be perfect. So we're going to close that up. Does anybody have any questions so far on what we've done so far. I still have more to go, but if anybody has any questions on what we've done so far, I'm happy to answer those. Pop them in the chat or just chime right in. Because I can't see everyone's face to see if anybody's raising their hands. All right, so our next step is these are going to go outside. So they can go outdoors. It's great if it snows right on them. That's fantastic. That's what we want. We're mimicking Mother Nature. When these seeds fall to the ground from the plants, the snow lands on them, the water lands on them, and they naturally will emerge in the spring. So again, we're just mimicking what Mother Nature does with a little protected environment. So we're going to set them out. You're not going to bring them inside because it's going to be cold. They just stay out. They're going to stay out. You're not bringing these back inside ever. There's no reason not. You want to put them in an area. Sometimes people want to put them up against their house, and that's okay. But if you have an overhang that's going to be right over your jug, that's going to block the water and the snow from getting in there. So that's not a good spot. It's only a good spot if water and snow can get in there. I like but for me, I have a nice east facing spot that's under a tree. So that's where I put mine because I know season that tree has no leaves. So the sun's getting in there and the moisture's getting in there. And then as those leaves start to emerge and my plant starts to get a little bit bigger, that dappled light is going to protect this from getting either sun scald, which it shouldn't get, but from getting dried out really quickly because it's, in the middle of my south facing lawn. That wouldn't be a great spot. Those jugs will dry out really quick and your babies will cook in their little mini greenhouses. So we don't want to do that to the plants. So you're going to monitor these jugs. When the weather starts getting warm, you can start peeking in them and seeing if anyone's emerging. You can lift them up and see if they feel really light. That might mean they need a drink. We've had some really unusual weather, and it was, up until fairly recently, a very dry season. It was fine because the seedlings hadn't emerged, but as the winter progresses and spring arrives and these start to emerge and we have drier days, you don't want these to dry out. Those seedlings are going to need moisture. So you can check on them. You can water gently right through the cap, or you can unstick the tape and water into them gently.
Nikki, we have a question which applies to this. Kristen asked, for an activity with little kids, would it work to use individual sized plastic water bottles, or are they too small and will they dry out?
So they would dry out really quickly, and that's why the individual sized jugs don't really work. The water bottles don't really work. They dry out really quick, and you would have to monitor them constantly. You would potentially be watering twice a day later on in the season once they have green growth up above. So a great resource for getting a quantity of milk jugs is a local coffee shop, a Starbucks. You can ask them to save them for you for a day, and they'll have bags full of them. If you know somebody who has sleep apnea and uses a CPAP machine, they actually use distilled water, so they go through a lot of jugs of water quickly. Even if you're on Facebook, you can ask your friends, hey, does anybody have any milk jugs? I usually ask my friends, and people know to start saving milk jugs for me so that I can share them with for other friends doing this or use them for myself. So there's lots of ways to get it. Bottled water, again, is another resource. Like I have actually this is distilled water jug here too. So, there's lots of resources for getting the jugs. You just kind of have to get a little creative.
And you said
yeah,
half-gallon jugs are good too?
Half-gallon jugs are good too. I wouldn't go any smaller than that, but the half jugs do hold up really well.
And also, I have another question. We're doing this middle of February. Is there a range of certain weeks during the winter, like don't start this activity before a certain date and don't go past a certain date?
That's a super question, actually. So after the winter solstice is a good time to start. And really getting into the next like 2 weeks is going to be like the end of the time that you can do this. I would suggest another week and a half, maybe. You know, we just don't know what the spring weather is going to be like. So you want to make sure that you have a long enough cold stratification period for these seeds. So I know that's tough because now people are thinking like, oh, I want to organize a group and do this. But even if you miss the window this year, you know, it's great to start planning for next year so that we can do more of this. And again, I'm happy to do, you know, Emily and I have done lots of workshops this winter for different organizations and groups. So during the winter, that's what we're doing. So we'd be happy to, you know, help people organize that going forward as well. So patience, we all need to be really patient. We're going to be so excited to see these babies growing, right? So you're going to be checking them all the time. As the weather starts to warm up and your seedlings start to reach about 2 inches tall, your seedlings, that's usually when I start to open up the jugs and let them have some access to, you know, the elements. So I'll open them up. Sometimes what I'll do is, oh, I guess I really tape this one good. You can open it up, and when it's opened, your milk, the hole of your milk jug will be over here. And I will put like a, sorry, I'm trying to see my hand in there. When your milk jug's open, you have the hole here, and I'll just stick a stick right through it so that it holds that wide open. Usually just bending it open keeps it open enough, but if I have sticks laying around, I'll poke them through to keep it open wide. And then once those seedlings are getting bigger, you can start to move them out to your garden. They should have a nice healthy root system on them. All the seeds that we gave you are seeds that should do fairly well and transplant easily. We didn't give you any really tricky seeds, so.
One more question about watering, Nikki. Do
Yep.
you only check for dryness once the weather warms?
So in the, like, if you've given these guys a good drink right now, I don't think that you should have to think about watering them again until the weather starts to warm up a little bit. And once you've opened your jugs up, if we're going to have a cold night, something that would drop below 40, I would go out and close the jugs, and you could put your tape back around, you could close them up. If you have lots of them, you can go out. I take a sheet and I just throw a sheet over everything for the night. That's enough protection from the elements when the weather drops, if the temperatures drop rather. Sorry, I'm just checking to make sure I'm telling you all the things. Emily, is there anything you want to add?
One more question of, please repeat when to open the jugs.
Okay, so you're going to start to open the jugs when you start seeing like 1 inch to 2 inches of green growth in those jugs, because that's going to tell us that the weather is actually starting to be warm enough outside that we can open them up. And you know what we can do too as part of this group is maybe we can send an email. I can talk with Beth, and we have the email list, and you know, maybe we can start a little Worcester Native Plant Initiative Facebook page so that we can sort of do this together, and I can show like, hey guys, like I'm opening up my jugs today, or look at what emerged in my jugs, or people can take pictures of the jugs that they created and where they put them so that we can kind of, you know, show each other what we're doing. And then you kind of have a baseline for like, oh, they're doing it. They're in Worcester. I could probably open mine, or that's how big their plants look like. That's what mine look like. Also, what would be great is that, you know, people chose different seeds, and, you know, people will have lots of plants after we do this. So there's an opportunity to share with other people in the group also, which would be great. So maybe something like that's an option also, you know, for sharing further. Again, I do have lots of extra seed packets here. I think I might even have some plants that I didn't hand out in the first round of seeds. So if you want to do this with more people, if you want to do this with a group, you do kind of need to do it in the next, you know, week and a half. But I'm happy to provide seeds. I live right off of Lake Ave. I can stick a basket outside my front door with a Ziploc bag, and you can come and grab the seeds that you need there, or you can go to the UU Church and grab them there as well. So I'm happy to, you know, offer both places, and I can share what seeds I have. I can go look in the box in a second and let you know what I do have in case it's different than what you already have.
I have another question. Like, what if I have seeds left over, let's say, and it's still, you know, early March? Is it conceivable to like find a place in my yard and just kind of stratify them outside, put some snow on them, or even, I know this might be borderline like questionable, but like find places roadsides where I could maybe put them if it's not private property? Or
I'm not advocating for that, but
You're not allowed to say yes to that. However, I know many people, yeah, it's called, Freddie calls it like
guerrilla seed bombing.
guerrilla seed bombing of
I do know
driving
people
down
do
and
it,
throwing
so.
native seeds out your car window as you're passing plots of land. Yes, but we can't advocate for that. But and actually,
but you could also go out into your yard. So when I'm doing a lot of seeding, and I'll have or I'm cleaning seeds. When I'm cleaning seeds, then I have like the leftover chaff and things like that. I kind of just make a big bowl full of it, and then I take that and I spread it out over in the wooded area across the street from me.
Yeah,
so
I did it yesterday.
Whatever arises from that. So it's just going out on top of the snow. Sometimes, like if I know, like I'm cleaning blue lobelia and I know where the blue lobelia plants are in my garden in the winter time, I'll go out and I'll just, you know, put the rest of that cleanings right by those plants so that more will emerge. And I'll kind of know that, like, oh, those are the other blue lobelia seeds. So.
Or you can use it as a pretext to talk to your neighbors. Look, I have these little seedlings. They're, you know, good for the local bees, and, you know, talk it up. And then the bees can go from your yard to their yard.
Yeah,
you know,
we're creating a really great pollinator pathway. So that was one of the things that we were thinking about in this, because the UU Church has created this amazing pollinator habitat garden in front of the church with just, it's an amazing resource. And so that's why we sort of targeted that area, because we were thinking we can create a pollinator pathway through that area, and that's sort of like home base for that. But plants everywhere. But as you're saying, like, oh, get your neighbors, because, you know, as we create our homegrown national parks, we can increase those national parks, you know, and then those pollinators don't have to go as far, you know, or they have even more resources as they travel. So I just wanted to go back to when we're planting out these, I touched on this earlier, but when we're going to plant these out, I was mentioning the hunk of seed method. So what we're going to do is in the springtime, when these are big enough to go out into your yard, or if you want to share them with other people, you might want to put them into pots for other people. So either way, you're going to take the milk jug. I put my hand over the top and sort of wiggle it and flip it over, and the whole thing kind of slides out. And when that happens, because our milk jugs actually have a crease on the bottom, I think you can kind of see that here, it actually really easily breaks into two chunks because of that crease. So now you have two big chunks. So 2 hunks of seedlings. HOS is a lot of times how you'll see it written if you join a Winter Sowing Facebook group or something like that. They talk about hunk of seeds. So you break that into 2, and then you could break those off into, it depends on how dense those seeds are, because we gave you so many different seeds, they're going to all germinate differently because they're different plants. So you want to have like a nice healthy little clump so that you can then put that cluster into your garden, or put it into a pot with other soil. You plant it at the same depth as the soil level is in your milk jug. So the top of that soil line should match the soil line top of the soil, either in your soil in the ground or in your container. Are there any other questions?
I have one more little thing.
Yeah.
I just remember I'm doing this time because I remember in the past you saying that using the vertical strips from a yogurt container as where are they all?
Oh, as labels. Yeah.
As labels, and I'm doing it this time and it's great. And I thought maybe you'd want to share about that.
Want me to? Yeah, I'm also using a yogurt container to scoop my soil. So what I usually do for labels is I actually take the milk jug and the yogurt container, and I just cut strips like this out of it. And these are like the perfect size for labeling. So I can put these labels right into my containers. So your yogurt container can be recycled or upcycled into labels, as well as a scoop for your soil. Thank you for reminding me to share that.
Nikki, I just wanted to ask, I saw someone had asked in the chat about where we got our seeds, and I'm not sure that got answered, but.
Oh, no, it didn't. So that's great. So the seeds came from several people in this group from our own gardens. We collected the seeds to share with you all. Some of them have probably come from native ecotypes here in this area collected, or they came from plants that some of us may have purchased and were growing out in our gardens.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk about how we can tell, like if we think there's a garden center selling native plants, how we can tell if they're native or not?
Sure. So there's a couple of things to think about. When you go to a traditional nursery, they may have a native plant section. Native plants are, catching on, so people want to grow them and sell them. When they do that, sometimes they're selling a cultivar. So a cultivar would be, if I had, so the blue lobelia, I'm going to make this up, but so we gave you blue lobelia. It's called Lobelia syphilitica. So it could be written blue lobelia, super blue in parentheses. So when that's written like that, that's telling you that that's a cultivar and not the straight species. The straight species is Lobelia syphilitica, nothing else. So if something's in parentheses, you know that that's a cultivar of the original species. And it's preferable not to grow those, because what happens is when they're creating these cultivars, they're creating them for us, not for the pollinators. So we would say there's lots of double blooming flowers that we as humans think are really beautiful and appealing. So, they create a cultivar or a hybrid and it looks really great. But what happens is now the bees can't actually get into them to get the pollen in the centers because of maybe those ruffled petals. So making these changes or changing the color, and now the insects no longer recognize the plant because we've changed the coloration of that. So you see that a lot with different types of echinacea. So you'll see there's like hundreds of different color variations. But we don't know, because it's not well researched, that they can still utilize these the same. In the research that's been done, there was a presentation by Annie White all about this recently, and what she's found in doing this research that's not well documented previously or at all previously is that the straight species are what the preference is.
Yeah, with Dr. Giguere and his research, they also are finding nectar and or pollen deficiencies, where a lot of these plants will spread via rhizomes or their roots. So they're not actually, their seed germination viability is also much lower. So they'll have the way that they're being pollinated then reduces the species spreading, but also for the at-risk bumblebees, there isn't the pollen and nectar quantities that the straight species have. So when you go to a garden center, it is looking for the way they named it. So just if there's any fancy name, then that's generally a red flag.
Does that answer that question for you?
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
There was one other question way back in the chat when we transitioned about goutweed and how to manage that as an invasive.
That one you just keep pulling and pulling and pulling. It does fortunately pull out fairly easily. I recommend, if you have a spading fork, it kind of looks like a pitchfork, but with like broader, flatter tines. It's really good to like dig that in to kind of gently lift the soil and pull up as much root matter as you can and just keep at it.
Some people will like mow it and hack it down to reduce, like basically weaken the root structure, and try the smothering technique of cardboard or heat and go well outside the perimeter of where it already is. It's the same kind of do your best, but it will take years of perseverance because it's invasive.
Yeah, if it's in an area where it's not in with other things, you can solarize the soil by putting like a tarp over it, but it takes a good quantity of time, like years of solarization to actually kill it. So it's a really tough one. I mean, that's why it's so important that we advocate, especially, you know, what I've been learning is that plants that aren't invasive now can become invasive over time. So we're bringing in all these plants from different places and utilizing them in our gardens, and that's great. You know, like the native plants, it's great, but when we're bringing in all these plants from other places, from you know, non-native locations, over time they may become invasive even if they aren't initially. So we have to be really cautious with what comes into our yards or into anywhere. So, you know, lots of things like
well, goutweed is
butterfly
still,
bush.
well, goutweed is still marketed in many places in the country as a good ground cover. Massachusetts, right. Vermont, some of New England is seen that it's aggressive and invasive, but you can't buy and sell it any longer in Massachusetts. But if you go somewhere else in the country, it still is at the garden centers as a good ground cover because it does every soil type. It does sun, it does shade, it doesn't care because it's a good ground cover. And now as we learn more and more and more, we realize that as humans, we need to maybe back off on introducing species in the wrong.
Right. English ivy is the same, right? You know?
Oh, I got a question about salad plastic box. How do you make a watering hole in the top?
Oh, okay. That's really easy. You're going to do it the same way you do the base. So you can drill holes, you can cut with the box cutter, scissor, the glue gun. You can just make the same holes that you're making in your base for your top. And then you would put that one on top and you could duct tape around the sides for those.
Also, might reiterate how you need 2 salad containers, not a salad container and a lid. Right?
That's correct. Yeah, you want to use 2 separate containers, 2 separate bases. And you're going to make one base, the base of your winter sowing, and one the top. So you're going to put them on top of each other. You need to have enough space for your soil, but you also have to have enough head space for those plants when they start to grow in your jugs, because you want to have, you know, enough room for there to be at least 2 to 3 inches, maybe more, because some of these grow fairly quickly in their jugs. Head space for those as they get taller.
Could you just repeat one more time about where to place these in the yard? And I just want to triple check that once the jugs are taped, you don't put the cap on. You have that opening.
That's right. Your cap,
so that means
recycle the cap today. You don't need the cap ever again. You're all done with the cap. You want that water going in. You want any excess humidity coming out, that hole in the top. So we're going to put those outside. You're going to look for a spot that's semi-protected. You don't want to put these like in the middle of your south-facing lawn. They'll be okay in the early spring, but as soon as it starts getting warm, they're just going to cook. You know, like you have to imagine that these are a greenhouse. So this is a mini greenhouse. We're creating the greenhouse effect for our plants here. So we want to put them in a semi-protected spot. I have mine in my yard under a big maple tree that's sort of east facing.
And obviously you can always move your jugs. So right now, if it's the easiest thing, and the fact that it's a snowstorm right now and you plop them outside, and then in a month or two, when it's not so slippery, you can adjust. Or if you see them baking and being overheated, you know, keep reevaluating where, you know, move them around your house if you really don't know.
Yeah, that's a great point. And the only thing to be cautious about is when you set them outside, that they're not under an overhang, because once they go out, you still want them to be getting that rain and snow on top of them. So set them out, you know, outside on your back step or something like that. Just make sure nothing's covering the tops of them.
Nikki and Emily, I had sort of a general question about if you are trying to like transition your yard to mostly like 80% natives or something like that, what would you recommend as far as like, would you remove the things that aren't native first, or would you just add the natives and then eventually down the line try to remove some stuff? Like what do you think would be the best way to go about that? I have about a 1/4 acre and there's a lot of like stuff from Asia and whatever, you know, that eventually I think I'll get rid of, but I guess I'm trying to figure out what's the best way to go about it.
That's definitely a great question.
There's different schools of thought. There's different way you won't be wrong in going either direction. Like I think you can make a great ecosystem by both removing and adding, or just adding.
Okay.
A lot of people, you have your favorite plants. We are humans who like our pretty flowers and our peonies or our lilac bush, or the things that remind us of people. And that's why we have them in our yard. And that's not to say to get rid of them, but to add in supportive plantings and to switch to, you know, a commitment of maybe, what you're adding is going to be strictly native. So when something does expire or lives its life and, you know, a chipmunk or a vole goes through that little bed of hostas, you don't resurrect the hostas, you pick a different plant to go with the hosta. It's kind of been my like approach. So it's not ripping the Band-Aid off, but even with small additions to your yard, I think some of it, the research is really not always having one plant. You need to have a clump. You need to be able to support what you're trying to offer to the insects and the birds and the bees. Right. So to have established plantings is important. So it's not one cardinal flower. It might be a clump of the 10 cardinal flower plants to really have enough pollen and nectar to support your hive of bumblebees. So there's lots of interesting emerging research on the quote unquote right way to do it. And by this point, it really is any step in the direction of supporting our natural ecosystem is the best you can do. So I wouldn't say tear apart your whole yard and spend a fortune on replanting everything, but adding in native would be the biggest priority. And What's your
And
ban?
removing any invasives as well. I would always say that's probably a great place to start, is
Mhm.
recognizing if you have any invasives and trying to remove those first, and then trying to fill those spots. And
Yeah.
then walk around the yard. Are there plants that you're like, I don't even like this? Like I
Mhm.
have no connection to this plant. Why do I have it? It was here when I moved in. I can pull that out. Like, great. Now I can plant something I feel passionately about in this space. Remember, it's your own yard. It's your own space. So
Right.
create it the way you want,
Mhm. Mhm. And how about bittersweet? Did you already talk about this or not? Will that just go
But that's
away the more
another
you kill it?
nasty invasive.
It's a nasty invasive that will not go away, and it will kill trees. It's very easily identifiable by an orange root. So if you're gardening and there's not even a bittersweet plant nearby and you see this lovely orange root system, just pull that one out because it'll be a new vine soon. So bittersweet does not go away on its own. It's an invasive. And I would say anecdotally, backtracking was for my own yard, I moved into my house and I had a burning bush. Now it did not seed all over my yard, but the birds eat it and are pooping out the seeds all through this conservation land that's adjacent to my house. So while I'm not seeing this plant being invasive in my space, it is invasive. It's causing an ecosystem issue just a few feet away from my yard. So I chose to take out my burning bush and replace it with something else because while it didn't seem invasive in my space, it was causing, it's like you can go down the rabbit hole very easily, but I would say bittersweet's on the list of, yes, pull it and do not make a wreath out of it.
Yeah, just a quick story. I took care of an elderly lady in Concord and would take my walks in the woods, and there was burning bush everywhere. It was crazy. I pulled up as much as I could, but yeah, it's I also had it in my yard, but it's really weird to connect that it goes other places. People don't believe it because they're so in love with burning bush,
There's some really great alternatives to burning bush. I'll just put in a plug for some of them. I know people really like the bright red fall color, but blueberry bushes are a great native alternative. What else do we have, Emily? We have a whole list of them. I've been working on some lists of plants that, if you want to remove something, what would be like a native alternative? So I have a nice list of plants like that. And blueberry is a really nice one because you get berries, but you also get the beautiful red foliage, the native sumac. There's a fragrant sumac, it's called, and that has a beautiful red leaf in the fall. It's not poison sumac, so you won't have a rash from that, but it has a beautiful fall color, and it provides berries. They're small berries. They're not showy berries, but they're a resource for the birds as well. So there are some nice alternatives if you're looking for something when you remove that burning bush from your yard and you want that vibrant red color in the fall.
Also, chokeberries are a good one too. And they have black, purple, and red berries, and really nice foliage.
That's a great one. Yeah, if anybody, we're all here, we're all learning, so please chime in. I'm just answering, but I would love to hear from other people because I'm here to learn also. So.
I know that I have so many questions. I know that you told us to watch the Doug Tallamy videos, which I have watched a couple of them, and I as well can't say enough about how it changed my whole life. But could you talk a little bit about keystone species and also, like, is there such a thing as a keystone perennial?
Yeah, so one of so we talked about the oak being a keystone species. One of the perennials that's a keystone species are the goldenrods. The goldenrods are a keystone species. And I can't remember if we provided I think we provided some wreath goldenrod, the blue stem goldenrod to folks. That's a good one. And the reason I chose that one is because The goldenrods, some of the goldenrods can be a little more aggressive in a cultivated garden, like in your yard. So those are, you might not want in a smaller garden bed. But this one that we gave you stays somewhat contained, or stays fairly contained. And it also does well in the shade, which is nice to have a bright yellow color in the shade, so sometimes people forget that, like, there are beautiful plants that do really well in the shade. The blue lobelia that we gave you does well in full sun and does well in the shade. Emily has it growing in her garden in full sun, and it's just taller than mine that grows in the shade. So there'll be a little bit of difference in height oftentimes, but when it says shade to sun, it really means you can use that throughout that range.
Yeah, we had
So
a
we
good
tried
question.
to make choices that would, suit everybody's yards as best we could, and heights as well, and bloom times, because that's important.
We had a good question in one of the workshops we did a couple weeks ago about that, where it's this, if I have shade, what do I do? Or it says part shade to sun. And we found, just anecdotally and trying to find out people's research, but mostly it's Nikki's yard versus my yard, dog outside, that the plants, the hardy New England plants, still will flower and still will do all their things, but they might be 18 inches versus my Jurassic yard where they're 4 feet tall, but the plants still manage to thrive and do what they're supposed to do in terms of the pollen and the nectar for the birds and the bees and the insects. So there's quite a range of tolerance for a lot of the seeds that you guys get for the native plants.
I mean, if it says full sun, then it really means just full sun. But if it gives you that nice range, use the range, like it really means it will do well in that, full sun to partial shade or full sun to shade range. I'm gonna see what other seeds I have, and so people know what else we have available, but if there's more questions, keep asking, I can hear.
Right, and I just wanted to say, if people by any chance, maybe not, have extra plants, if you plant all of these and you find you can't use them, the Worcester Native Plant Initiative will be doing more projects around the city. Hopefully this spring through the summer. We have a possibility of planting out at the Worcester Public Library and a couple of other places. So if you want to just return, some of your seedlings to the Worcester Plant Initiative, Native Plant Initiative, that is perfectly fine. So don't feel like, don't throw them away. You can give them away to neighbors or friends. And we also will take the plants back because hopefully we'll have plenty of places to put them.
I also have a few more seeds here. I don't know, did we give out Penstemon digitalis to the group? I have Penstemon digitalis.
Sure, I don't think so.
Okay, I do have some Penstemon digitalis here, which is a really beautiful one. And the Penstemon digitalis, Emily, which one of the at-risk bumblebees does this one support? Do you know off the top of your head? I know it supports at least one of them.
I know it supports vegans. I have to look at Gare's list for Bombus fervidus. I believe it does, but
okay. So that one, and we have some New York ironweed here. I have some purple Joe Pye, and I have just a couple of the butterfly milkweed. So if there's, any interest in those, as I said, I'm right off of Lake Ave, so I can put them outside for folks. You can shoot me a message in the chat and or you can email us and we can let you know how to pick them up if you'd like.
I also took some extra seeds, and I have a couple New England aster, which I'm just always crazy about because it's such a good nectaring flower when it's getting chilly. Yeah, so I could offer those?
Actually, I want to say that asters might be one of the keystone species as well. I'm not
I'm pretty sure it is
100%, but I
indeed.
feel like they fall into that
Mhm.
area as well. They are a very important resource because they are a late blooming fall resource.
So back to Penstemon digitalis, it does support all three of the at-risk native bumblebees that Giguère is studying. So it's a key, it's an important plant.
Emily, can you tell them a little bit about what Dr. Giguère's found in his research garden? I know, you know, at the Beecology garden, maybe if you can talk about what he saw when the plants weren't there versus when he planted them.
Yeah, so I'm in Southborough, and we have a lot of open space owned by or managed by different committees, some by towns, some by it's a complicated network of who manages these spaces. But we have one called the Breakneck Hill Conservation Area, and Dr. Giguère actually lives in Framingham. So he was, I think, anecdotally walking like with his kids, and he happened to see the bee that he was trying to research. And the first year he has grad students that work with him, and they found like a very small colony of Bombus fervidus, which is very close to being on the endangered species list here in Massachusetts. And it was like finding the bee and then seeing what it's using in this not managed at the time open space. And it was using things at the community gardens, or people were planting non-native flowers or clover and then it's evolved over the past 5 years to, there's a research garden that went in almost 2 years ago with the beginning of COVID, where it's not planted as a beautiful it's not planted as an ornamental garden. It's planted in clumps as a scientific research garden. And it's been, the research has been really interesting to see how the populations of these at-risk species are thriving and doing really well. And with all the different native plants that are there and on his list, most of them are at the garden, to be able to really study these understudied bees, where honeybees have been studied because they're a livestock, so everybody knows about honeybees, but our native bees have not been studied because they haven't seen, there's no money for the research, they haven't been valued. So now more and more scientists are recognizing the value and the impact on our climate, and our decline of the intersection of the decline of the plants is the decline of the insects and the bees. So it's been really a great project to be a volunteer and a part of. I'm not one of the grad students. I wish maybe once upon a time that was where my college education led me, but that's not how it happened. So as an adult, it's been really fun to kind of go just to be a part of something like this. And he's now expanding his research to include the various moths and butterflies and other tiny insects, because the research gardens that he's established have been they're documenting so many more insects, not just the at-risk bumblebees, that they can't ignore some of the other science that they're seeing and how things are related to each other. So it's a great, and you guys can come out. It's Route 9 in Southborough. Take a right at the Starbucks, and you go up the little road, and there's a walkable hiking path, and there's a research garden right there. It's a very accessible, great place to go check things out. But Dr. Giguère has been kind of leading on the bumblebee species in Massachusetts for the past couple of years. And it's a great, Nikki may have mentioned in the slideshow that if you go through the links, he has a citizen science research piece. So in your own yard, if you see a bumblebee, it goes through how to log it, how to video it, how to identify it, and submit it. And then his grad students and or him will review it. So you can be wrong. You can be 100% wrong. I realize I've learned that I cannot identify insects as well as I can identify plants. And you can, as an adult, go and walk around with your phone and follow bumblebees and then upload them and have actual people review what you're finding. And you can log your location in Worcester and contribute to the research that's happening in our state to protect the native pollinators. So I'm a big fan of the project, just because it's fascinating and it's really important.
Do you know what the name of the app is, Emily?
So it's under his Bee College. I think it's Beecology. So BEE and then Ecology. So on our website link and our info, like ladyfern.farm/learn more, I separated out his website links, and there's one that is Beecology, and that's how you can go and find it for your Android or for your phone. It's a little rocky. It's not there. The app was developed with a grant and some grad students, so there's some user it's just some hiccups sometimes, and sometimes it's easier to do it from your computer versus your phone, but the actual it's contributing to what's happening in our state, and paying attention to what you put in your yard and what you can see. It's a great way of expanding the research.
Thank you.
I had a question about, so the vision I have in mind is basically in my garden, have all these native flowers, you know, all the way from April to October, because all the different times of blooming. And I was wondering if there was some kind of contraindication to what to put with what, or what to plant next to what. Or are there plants that do not get along as native plants and we shouldn't plant them in the same area or something? That's the question.
I don't think that, I think what you just have to be aware of is that some plants can be more aggressive than other plants. So if you're trying to grow something that might be, you know, more delicate species next to a really aggressive species, that aggressive species will sort of win out and take over. So I would be aware of that. Otherwise, you know, you really want, they say, right spot, right? What is it, Emily? Can you help me out?
Yeah. Right plant, right spot.
So you want to have, you know, you want to meet the needs of the plant. So, you know, if you have a wet spot, you want to grow a plant that's going to do well in a wet area. If you have really dry soil, you'll see oftentimes it says, you know, dry conditions. So that's when you want to plant, you know, that plant there, or shade versus sun. You're not going to put a full sun plant into the shade and vice versa. So more of being aware of that, and then also being aware of the aggressiveness of some plants because they may overtake other things in your garden.
So we don't have it up on the website, but in one of the things that we were looking to do, which I did actually at Breakneck Hill, was it was kind of like a scavenger hunt of to look at the plant, like a little sheet of surveying your yard to see if you have nectar and pollen for each month. And it's hard to do. So the spreadsheet that Dr. Giguere has, it has all that information. But when you look at your yard, it's a complicated puzzle to make sure that you really are supplying nectar and pollen through the entire season. And so we haven't quite hashed out how to present that to people, to like have your own little checklist, because when you look at the plant list, it is there's a lot of options. So I would look, you know, as you go through your growing season, of what's not flowering and where are your gaps. Or if you have a great spring, you've got May and June totally covered, and your garden's great with native plants, make sure they're both pollen and nectar plants. And Dr. Giguere's list does separate out the plants, or you can go to Go Botany or other resources, because some plants are primarily nectar plants and some are primarily pollen plants. But that's a next level. Sometimes it's just adding the native plants is where you need to start. And then the next level comprehension is really making sure you're meeting the needs throughout the whole growing season.
Thank you so much, ladies.
Sorry, what?
Thank you. I just said thank you so much.
Oh, yeah.
You're welcome.
I just was taping up another bottle, and I was reminded of also hearing you talk about, which I appreciate because sometimes I move a little too quickly, how when you lift the bottle up, be careful that the duct tape may or may not be sticking totally well, and lift it from the bottom as well, or just double check that it's really sticking. And I just appreciated you mentioning that in the past.
Oh, that's helpful. Thank you, Joanne. I sometimes, you know, gloss over things because in my mind there, wrote. So I appreciate you reminding people, because that's a really good thing to think about. So when you pick up those jugs, make sure it's taped really well so you don't have soil and seeds all over the place.
And we also appreciate the feedback, because we're working on our PDFs and we're rolling out the stuff, but I'm writing a note to add that to the PDF as well.
If there aren't any other questions, Beth, do you have anything you want to say to the group before we
Yeah,
say
I just want to
goodbye?
say
Or-
thank you to everybody for coming and taking a Sunday afternoon. And I'm just really happy that everybody was able to come and get seeds and now do some planting. And thank you so much to Nikki and Emily for all of your hard work. We appreciate it. And we'll look forward, if you want to get involved with us on our committee, we're happy to have you. And hopefully we'll be doing some more planting in Worcester this spring. So thank you.
Thank you all so much for coming. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
And feel free to email if you have any other questions going forward. If you want to get some more seeds, if you want to do this for a group, we would really, we feel really passionately that we want to get these seeds and these plants out to people. So we have seeds to share. If, it's too late in the season to get things planted, Emily and I will have a plant sale in the spring and in the fall, and possibly plants through the summer as well. So you can reach out to us at Lady Fern Farm and you can come to one of the sales and buy plants.
Thank you, Nikki.
Thank you all so much. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Do you guys want to stay and hang and talk about anything?
We might, maybe we can we turn off the recording, Emily?
Mm-hmm.
Have a little meeting?